The curator's hands stopped moving. She had been cataloging the lower vault for 6 hours. A routine audit, the kind assigned to junior archivists who needed something tedious to occupy their first rotation on an alien world. But her scanner had just returned a reading she didn't recognize, and in 40 years of xenoarchaeological work across 11 systems, Vessel Keeper Orin had never encountered a reading she didn't recognize. The object on the shelf was small, cylindrical, made of something that registered as neither metal nor polymer but somehow both. It was warm to the sensor sweep in a way that suggested it had been warm for a very long time, not recently activated, not recently handled, but continuously, quietly, persistently warm for what the isotopic layer suggested was somewhere between 900 and 1100 years. It had been sitting in this vault, in this building, on this unremarkable peninsula of the continent humans called Europe, generating a faint and purposeless heat for approximately 1,000 years. And no one had told them about it. The Meridian Compact had not come to Earth looking for trouble. That was the first thing Ambassador Serethvel would say later, in the tribunal, when the full scope of what had happened finally collapsed into something that could be spoken aloud without causing the speaking party to require sedation. They had come with a mandate, a legal one, ratified across 47 civilizations, translated into every major galactic tongue, and delivered to Earth's Unified Governance Council with enough diplomatic ceremony to suggest the compact took both the mission and the species seriously. The Galactic Weapons Moratorium was not a punishment. Serethvel needed Earth's representatives to understand that. It was a framework, a living document that every civilization reaching a certain threshold of destructive capability was required to comply with. Humanity had crossed that threshold 4 years ago, according to the Compact's instruments. The moratorium required full disclosure of all weapons systems, all armaments research, and all destructive yield technologies, followed by a staged decommission process supervised by Compact observers. It was, Serethvel had explained during the initial meeting, entirely routine. The human at the other end of the table, a compact, gray-haired woman named Director Edissa Okafor, who represented Earth's Unified Governance Council on matters of interstellar compliance, had listened to the full presentation without expression. Not polite blankness. Not diplomatic restraint. Something harder to name. Something that felt, Serethvel would later recall, like patience of a very specific and unsettling kind. When the presentation concluded, Okafor had said 4 words. "We expected you eventually." Not "we accept your terms," not "we have questions," not even "we will need time to consult our councils," just that. "We expected you eventually," as though the Compact's arrival had been penciled into a calendar somewhere, decades or centuries ago, and humans had simply been waiting for the appointment to arrive. Serethvel had assumed it was a cultural expression, a face-saving formality, the kind that civilizations often deployed when they were caught off guard but didn't want to appear so. She had smiled, expressed gratitude for humanity's cooperative spirit, and moved forward with the logistics of the audit. That was the first mistake. The audit began 3 weeks later, once the Compact's full assessment team had made landfall and established working relationships with the human liaisons assigned to each sector. There were 42 of them, researchers, archivists, weapons analysts, legal observers, and 1 cultural liaison named Orin, who had specifically requested an assignment to what humans called a historical site rather than an active military installation. She had thought it would be quiet. The building she was assigned to was called the Repository of Accumulated Technologies. It occupied the footprint of what had once been a medieval fortress, expanded over centuries into something that was half museum, half archive, half something the architectural notation kept failing to categorize. Human buildings frequently did this, grew in ways that resisted clean classification, adding wings and sublevels and annexes without apparent design logic, until the whole structure became a record of itself as much as anything it contained. The human liaison assigned to her was a young man named Tomas. He was 26, had studied Xenorelations at a university in the city nearby, and spoke Compact Standard with an accent that bent certain consonants in directions they weren't designed to go. He had greeted her with a handshake, that peculiar human gesture that involved placing unprotected biological tissue directly into the appendage of an unknown entity, and had seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that her skin was the color of deep water and her secondary eyes were located where humans kept their temples. "I'll show you around," he had said. "Though fair warning, there's more here than the official inventory suggests." She had thought he was being modest. He was not being modest. The lower vault was the fourth sublevel. Orin had catalogued the first 3 without incident, recording equipment that matched Earth's submitted disclosure documents with only minor discrepancies. A few items listed as decommissioned that showed signs of recent maintenance, a handful of energy signatures that ran slightly hotter than expected, nothing that triggered her threshold alerts. The fourth level was different. "Thomas," she said, not looking up from her scanner, "what is this?" He appeared at her shoulder. He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned in 3 weeks that Tomas's silences were not empty. They were calculated. "That," he said, "is a heat keeper." A heat keeper. That's the old name for it. From about 900 years ago. The people who built it called it something in a language that doesn't exist anymore. The translation comes out roughly as the thing that remembers it was warm. Orin looked at the object. Then at Tomas. "What is it for?" Another silence. Then, "That depends on who's asking." She filed the exchange in her report that evening with a notation she hadn't used since her first assignment. Object purpose deliberately obscured by liaison, reason unclear. She had used that notation 3 times in 40 years. Twice, it had preceded events she subsequently described as the most professionally significant of her career. Once, it had preceded something she never discussed. She was beginning to suspect this was not going to be the second kind. By the end of the first month, Serethvel was no longer certain the audit was going as expected. The weapons disclosure had proceeded smoothly on the surface. Human representatives had been cooperative, organized, and thorough, sometimes suspiciously so, presenting documentation that was not merely current but appeared to anticipate every category the compact's legal framework required. The submissions were complete. Almost too complete. As though humans had read the moratorium's requirements in advance and prepared accordingly. Which should have been impossible. The moratorium's specific provisions were classified above the level of any civilization that hadn't yet been contacted. "They couldn't have known the exact requirements," said her second-in-command, a long-limbed analyst named Drevith, during one of their private debriefs. "The document isn't public until formal contact is initiated." "I know," Serethvel said. "So the compliance documentation matches our requirements with a margin of error below 2%. She set down her cup. "Which means either they guessed, or they didn't need to guess, or they have access to something they shouldn't have access to. Or," Drevith said carefully, "they prepared for all possible requirements." The room was quiet for a moment. "That," Serethvel said, "would require a very long time." Drevith did not answer. She didn't need to. The second month brought the first formal incident. One of the weapons analysts, a meticulous, humorless researcher named Voss, had been assigned to a decommissioned military research complex in the region humans called the American Southwest. The complex had been listed as inactive since approximately 200 years prior. The listing was accurate. The complex was, without question, inactive. What it was not was empty. "There are 17 distinct weapons programs here," Voss transmitted back to the central team. "All decommissioned. All fully documented in Earth's disclosure. Every last one." The pause. "But the infrastructure is not decommissioned." "Clarify," Serethvel said. "The equipment that ran the programs. The power systems. The data networks. The manufacturing tolerances built into the facility's bones. Those are not decommissioned. They're dormant." Another pause, longer. "Ambassador, this facility could be brought to full operational capacity in approximately 72 hours. Is that within the moratorium's violation thresholds?" "No. Dormant infrastructure is technically compliant." The word technically arrived with a weight that made everyone in the room look at each other. "But, Ambassador, this facility was built in that dormant configuration. It was never operational and then powered down. It was designed from construction to be activatable on short notice. This wasn't mothballing. This was..." Voss stopped. Was what? Was waiting. By week 9, Oren had cataloged approximately 4,000 objects in the repository's lower vaults. Of those, 317 were not on any inventory. Not missing from the inventory. Not incorrectly categorized. Simply absent, as though whoever compiled the official record had looked at these objects and made a conscious decision not to write them down. The objects themselves were wildly varied. Small devices, material samples, sealed containers, things she couldn't identify the category of, let alone the function. But they shared 3 characteristics that she kept returning to in her notes. They were all old. Most exceeded 500 years, many exceeded 800. They were all warm. Not dangerously, not obviously, but persistently and specifically warm in ways that suggested active processes running at a level too low to register as threatening. And they were all, every single one, oriented in the same direction. Not physically, not magnetically, but directionally. In a sense, her instruments kept trying to describe and kept failing to describe precisely. As though each object was, in some way she couldn't yet define, pointing at something. Tomas, she said on the 63rd day, I need you to tell me what these things are pointing at. He was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that she turned to look at him. He was not evasive. He was not stalling. He looked, she realized, like a person who had been waiting to be asked a specific question and was now determining whether the moment had arrived. That, he said finally, is a question for Director Okafor. The meeting with Okafor happened 4 days later, in a room that was not on any of the building's official plans. Not hidden, exactly, accessible via a corridor that Tomas walked to without hesitation, suggesting he had walked it before, but absent from the documentation the compact had been provided. Okafor was already there when they arrived. Serethvel had come with Drevith and Voss. Oren had come with her scanner and a growing sensation she could not name but recognized, distantly, as the biological analog of what humans called dread. Okafor looked at the assembled compact team and said, "You found the 3rd layer." "Third layer of what?" Serethvel asked. "Of the answer to your audit." Okafor's voice was not unfriendly, but it was extraordinarily level, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation without knowing exactly who would be on the other side of it. "You've completed the inventory of our weapons. You've found the dormant infrastructure. Now you're here because Vesselkeeper Oren's scanner found something in the lower vaults that doesn't match any category in your framework." A silence. "How long," Serethvel said carefully, "have you known we were coming?" Okafor tilted her head slightly. "Specifically? We identified the Meridian Compact's expansion vectors about 300 years ago. We calculated probable contact inside 2 centuries at that point. But the preparation itself," she paused, "started closer to 1,000 years ago. The air in the room changed." "That's impossible," Drevith said. 8,000 years ago, you didn't have. "We didn't need to know about you specifically," Okafor said. "We only needed to know that someone would eventually come. Someone with more power than us. Someone with legal frameworks we hadn't written. Someone who would arrive and ask us to give things up." She looked at each of them in turn. Humanity has a very long relationship with that scenario. What happened next was the moment Serethvel would spend the rest of her career trying to accurately describe. Okafor had placed a device on the table, small, unremarkable, clearly very old. And she had said, "I'm going to show you what the audit missed. Not because we're required to, because you've earned the right to understand what you're actually looking at." She pressed a single point on the device's surface. Every scanner in the room went dark. Not damaged. Not jammed. Simply paused. As though the instruments had been politely asked to stop speaking for a moment. Oren checked her primary scanner, her backup, the passive sensor woven into her suit. All dark. All returning a single notation she had never seen in 40 years of fieldwork. Observational suspension, legacy protocol active. Legacy protocol, Oren said aloud, because the words needed to be spoken to be believed. That uses a compact internal command structure. That notation only exists inside our own. Inside your own system architecture, Okafor agreed. Yes. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Serethvel had ever sat inside. You're inside our systems, Drevith said. The words came out very slowly, the way words do when the mind is processing something it would prefer not to process. We've been observing your system architecture for approximately 200 years, Okafor said. We didn't penetrate it. We didn't break anything. We listened, from the outside, the way you'd learn a language by standing near people who speak it. Patiently. For a very long time. She looked at Serethvel. Ambassador, I want to be clear, we have not used this access aggressively. We have not altered your systems. We have not taken anything. We have only watched. Because we needed to understand, before you arrived, exactly what you would ask us to give up, and whether we could afford to give it. And? Serethvel asked. And we can, Okafor said. Most of it. The weapons you asked for, you can have them. The programs are genuinely decommissioned. The disclosure documents are complete and honest. She placed her hands flat on the table. But I need you to understand what you nearly missed. Because what you nearly missed is the reason we spent 1,000 years preparing for this conversation, and it is not what your framework was designed to handle. The objects in the lower vault, Orin now understood, were not weapons. They were not armaments, not research devices, not destructive yield technologies of any kind. They were something the moratorium had no category for, because no civilization in the Compact's member roster had ever built anything quite like them. They were, in the oldest and most literal sense of the word, insurance. Not insurance against defeat. Insurance against forgetting. 8,000 years ago, Tomas said, and Orin realized, with a small shock, that he had been cleared to explain this, that he had been waiting this entire time for this specific moment. Humanity had already survived enough civilizational collapses to understand something important. Knowledge can be destroyed. Culture can be erased. A species can be reduced to starting over, and the starting over is brutal, and the things lost in the reduction are sometimes lost permanently. He gestured at the vault around them. So they started building libraries. Not of books. Of processes. Active processes, running continuously, too slow and too low to be noticed, designed to preserve not information but capability, the knowledge of how to rebuild, how to remanufacture, how to reconstruct, embedded in objects that look inert because they are, mostly, inert. Running at 1% of capacity. Waiting. Waiting for what? Orin asked. For the moment they'd be needed. He looked at the small cylindrical object on the shelf, the heat keeper with its 1,000-year warmth. They're pointed at each other. All of them, in every vault, in every repository across the planet. They form a network. If something catastrophic happened, if your compact or anyone else reduced Earth to rubble, within a certain window of time, the network would activate. Not defensively. Not as a weapon. It would begin transmitting, to every surviving human anywhere in the galaxy, the complete accumulated technical and cultural knowledge of the species. Everything needed to start again. He paused. From scratch, if necessary. In 100 years, or 500, or 1,000. However long it took. Orin looked at the objects differently now. At all of them. The warmth she had been measuring for 63 days, not an anomaly. Not a malfunction. A heartbeat. They built a species-level resurrection protocol, she said. They built it 980 years ago, Tomas said. And they've been maintaining it ever since. Updating it every generation. Adding to it. Every time human civilization advanced in any meaningful direction, they added that advancement to the network. He smiled slightly, and it was not a happy smile. Your moratorium covers weapons. Your framework has categories for destructive yield technologies, armaments research, military infrastructure. But you have no category for this. Because no one in your compact has ever needed to build it. The tribunal convened 11 weeks later. Serethvel presented her findings with the care of someone defusing something. The compact's legal panel, 7 jurists from 5 civilizations, none of whom had ever personally encountered humanity before, listened to the full account in the kind of silence that suggested they were revising several assumptions simultaneously. The first revision was the obvious one. Earth had not hidden weapons. The disclosure was genuine, the decommissions real, the compliance complete. On every metric the moratorium required, humanity had passed. The second revision was harder to articulate. The legal panel spent 4 days trying to determine whether the repository network violated any existing framework. The answer kept coming back the same way: no. Not because it was harmless, no one was prepared to call it harmless, but because it was entirely, categorically, technically outside the moratorium scope. The moratorium governed destruction. The network was oriented entirely toward continuation. It's not a weapon, one of the jurists said, on the second day of deliberations. It is definitionally the opposite of a weapon. It is a weapon against extinction, another replied. Then our framework has a gap. Our framework, said the third quietly, was written by civilizations that assumed extinction was something that happened to you, not something you prepared for. The third revision took longer, and it was the one that kept Serethvel awake. In the final session, she had asked Okafor a question she had been holding for weeks. She had asked it carefully, because she suspected the answer would require careful holding. Director, the network, the capability transmission system, how long is it designed to operate? Okafor had looked at her without blinking. Indefinitely. Indefinitely. Until there are no humans left to receive the signal. And even then, a pause, we've seeded relay stations. In locations we haven't disclosed, because they're not weapons and the moratorium doesn't require it. So even if every human is gone, the transmission continues. For as long as the physics permits. Serethvel had sat with that for a long moment. A dead species, still transmitting. Still saying, asterisk, here is what we knew. Here is what we built. Here is what we were. Asterisk, not as a memorial. As instructions. Why? She asked. Not diplomatically. Not officially. Just what? Okafor's expression shifted. The first time in all their meetings that it had shifted in a way that felt entirely unguarded. Something tired came into it. Something old. Because we've been almost gone before, she said. More than once. And we know what it costs to rebuild from nothing. We know what's lost, and how long it stays lost, and how many generations live and die in that loss without knowing what they're missing. She looked at her hands. We decided a long time ago that if we were going to go, if something bigger and stronger and meaner was going to take us apart, then the least we could do was make sure the things we'd learned went on without us. So that whoever rebuilt, even if it took 10,000 years, would have a head start. Even if they never knew where the knowledge came from. The room was silent. Even, Serethvel said, if the rebuilders weren't human? The relay stations don't check, Okafor said. They just transmit. To whoever's listening. The pause. We figured if someone was rebuilding from an extinction event, they probably needed the help. The audit closed 14 weeks after it began. The compact issued its formal determination. Earth was in full compliance with the Galactic Weapons Moratorium. The determination ran to 400 pages. The last 60 were addenda that no one had requested, a series of internal analyses the compact's legal panel had generated, apparently unable to stop themselves, attempting to characterize what they had found on Earth. The addenda were never officially distributed. They circulated anyway, across 47 civilizations, in the way that documents always circulate when the people who wrote them simultaneously don't want anyone to read them and can't stop thinking about them. Oren read them on her transport home, 14 weeks after her scanner returned a reading she didn't recognize. She read them twice. The final addendum was the shortest. It had no official author. It had been added to the document late, without committee approval, by someone who had apparently decided the formal language was insufficient. It read, asterisk, the moratorium assumes that civilizations capable of destruction are civilizations that must be restrained from destroying. This assumption requires revision in at least one case. The human species has spent 1,000 years building not toward destruction but toward survival, specifically, survival of the knowledge that makes civilization possible against any conceivable threat, including threats from entities with legal authority over them. They did not resist the moratorium. They complied fully. They gave us what we asked for. They simply did not stop there. They had already given future versions of themselves something we cannot confiscate, regulate, or classify because we do not have a word for what it is. Asterisk. We arrived to collect their weapons. Asterisk. What we found instead was something we cannot take away. A species that had already decided, centuries before we came, that it would outlast everything. Not through strength. Not through defiance. Through a kind of patience that has no analog in our frameworks. Through the willingness to plant seeds for harvests they would never personally witness, for people who might not remember their names, against catastrophes that might never come. Asterisk. Asterisk. They were ready for us. They have been ready for everyone. Asterisk. They will be ready for whatever comes next. And somewhere in a vault on a peninsula in Europe, a small cylindrical object sits on a shelf, quietly warm, pointing at its brothers and sisters across the planet, maintaining a signal that has not faltered in 1,000 years. It does not know we came. It does not know we left. It just keeps transmitting. It will keep transmitting long after we are gone. We came to collect humanity's weapons. We did not understand, until the end, that the most dangerous thing humanity ever built was not designed to kill anything. It was designed to make sure humanity could never truly die. And looking back at everything we saw, everything we measured, everything we failed to categorize, I think that might be the most frightening thing I have ever encountered in 47 years of interstellar law. Not because it threatens us. Because it doesn't need to.